Good morning, everyone. We'll start in just a minute after everyone rolls in. Thank you. Okay, everyone, we'll just get started. I think our waiting room is now on its way in. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Pamela Robinson. I am the director and a professor at the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Ryerson University. And for today's purposes, I'm the interim academic director of City Building Ryerson. We're really excited today to welcome you to our Fresh Voices series. Dr. Biglieri is the last of our speakers in this series, and the series is intended to give us an opportunity to share the amazing new colleagues that we've recruited to Ryerson and to give them a chance to talk about their research, both among the Ryerson community members and in the broader community at large. You'll have a chance to learn about their new ideas and their perspectives on research. And it's also a chance for you to start to connect with our research team. The way this session is set up today is that Dr. Biglieri is going to do a short presentation, and then you can ask questions formally. And then at the end, we have what we call the after party, where you can turn on your microphone and ask questions directly if you've got something specific that you think isn't of broader interest. As I noted, this is the last of our series. It doesn't mean that this is the end of our big ideas being shared, but this is the last of Fresh Voices. All of our new colleagues' sessions have been videotaped or have been recorded on Zoom and are available on the City Building Ryerson website. If you like this one and haven't attended the others, I'd encourage you to listen in. And I think you're going to be really impressed with the good work of Dr. Biglieri, and you might want to share it. So we'd be delighted if you could help us forge new connections. It's been a really exciting series. So before we start, it's really important that we begin with an acknowledgement of the land on which Ryerson University sits. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is the treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee people that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. As you know, I just said I'm an urban planner, so is Dr. Biglieri. For us in our profession, this land acknowledgement is particularly important because our work takes place in community and on the land. We are practitioners of land-based planning that has a long colonial past. And so this land acknowledgement, although a common start to many meetings, is something that we take actively and seriously. And certainly in our school, we are working to try to decolonialize our curriculum and to help planners embed Indigenous perspectives in their planners' lens. You also may have heard that in August 2021, the university announced a process for renaming. And this process is important if you're interested in the Ryerson University history and future. You can learn more about it at the Next Chapter website on the ryerson.ca website. And there are actually steps that are forthcoming towards choosing a new name. So if you'd like to be engaged, we'll put the link in the chat. Okay, let's start with some housekeeping before we turn it over to Dr. Biglieri. So as I said, we're going to start with a short informal presentation and then a chance for discussion. I've got a few questions to kick us off with. And then if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see that there's a Q&A button. You are welcome, as soon as a question strikes you, to add it to the Q&A. We will do our best to make space for all of the questions that we get if we can. And as I noted at the end of the formal part, we'll take down the slides and then you'll have a chance, if you have a specific question, to ask Samantha directly yourself. If there's a question that you really want to make sure that we get to, you can upvote it. The session is being recorded, as I said before. And if you're interested, you're welcome to tweet and tag us at @CityBuildingRU. Okay, and we're using the hashtag @CityBuildingRU. All right, let's go with the star of the show today. I'm so happy to introduce my colleague, Dr. Samantha Biglieri. She's an assistant professor in the School of Urban and Regional Planning and a practicing urban planner, along with being a stellar researcher. Her research uses critical approaches to the intersection of urban planning and health and well-being, and she makes connections that builds research connections with practice to lead to more inclusive and accessible communities. She has 3 focuses of research that she's going to talk about. The first one is understanding the experiences of people living with dementia in their neighborhoods. The next one is aging in the built environment, housing and policy. And the third one is understanding experiences and governance of suburban and urban areas. So her research into age-friendly cities is really timely. It's important. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Biglieri, to talk about your work, and then we'll jump into questions and answers. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pamela. And I'm just going to share my screen really quick here. I am absolutely thrilled to be here today. And thank you so much for having me. I thought I'd start off with a little introduction because I think it's really important for you to understand where I come from as a scholar and a practitioner, because that's what shapes the knowledge and the work that I produce. And of course, Zoom doesn't want to work with me. Here we go. All right, so a little bit about me. As Pamela said, I am a practicing planner. My background is in land use planning consulting. I am also really involved in the community, specifically with the Toronto Council on Aging, which is a grassroots nonprofit here in the city of Toronto, focusing on civic engagement and education and a variety of other programming. Been involved with them for quite a while now. And really what's important here is that my background and experience in practice and community is what led me to academia, and it really informs how I structure research, from scoping out a problem to translation and findings to practice. So in terms of what do I draw on as a scholar, I'm a planner first and foremost, but I also draw and have my fingers in all these other different disciplines, as a good planner should. And so a couple of these different disciplines are things like the geographies of cognition. So how do our brains work when they're wayfinding? I also look at things like social citizenship and dementia, specifically trying to read a lot about people's firsthand accounts of living with dementia, because I think that's really important. I also draw on critical disability studies and critical access studies. It's really shaped how I think about this work, and then also the advocates who are living with dementia are pushing for dementia to be seen as a disability. And so we're trying to learn what are the pieces from that rights movement, from how they think about relationality, complexity, interdependency that we can think about for people living with dementia. And then I also draw on more broader urban studies debates about the center and the periphery, peripheralization, suburban areas. That's something that sort of flows through all of my work. And finally, these critical approaches to public health. And all of these things are in my mind as I'm doing work. So like Pamela said, my area of expertise is sort of at this nexus of planning and public health. Perhaps ironically, my dad's a planner, my mom's a public health nurse. They didn't plan it that way, but that's just how it happened. And really, I want to do research with people who are and have been excluded from the city in a variety of different ways. And I do research from a variety of perspectives, from more quantitative analysis to really deep qualitative relational work. But really, it's about how do our planning decisions, policies, and processes impact the experiences of the most marginalized, and my projects are really inspired by that. So to tell you a little more about these areas, the one about suburban areas and governance, been working with colleagues really to try to understand experiences at our social, spatial, and institutional peripheries. So I've been doing some work with colleagues in Italy and at York University, Roger Kyle, Giuliani Jacobelli, and then Lorenzo Duvidiovic, about how long-term care was dealt with in the Canadian context, but then also in the Italian context, and looking at health and social welfare as well. You'll notice suburban sort of goes through all of my areas. That's why it's a Venn diagram. The second area is aging and built environment and housing. We recently co-edited a book about aging people, aging places, experiences across Canada. So stay tuned for that. We're actually creating a website where we're asking older adults to submit stories, videos, photos, poems of experiences of aging. So stay tuned. And then the piece we're going to talk about today, which is dementia and planning. And I know Pamela's going to ask me some questions about that. Something else I'm really interested in is this idea of care as an organizing principle and a way of understanding everyday life in the city. I really think it can get at these interdependencies, complexities of human behavior. I'm happy to chat more about that. And then I'm also really interested in accessibility. So how do planners talk about it? How do we learn about it? And then how do we do it? And how do we end up with such inaccessible places still? And so I'll leave it there and pass it back for questions.
Thank you. So Samantha, let's start with your research on dementia-friendly planning. why that particular focus? Maybe you can tell everyone a little bit about your path to arriving on this research area, but also maybe help people understand what dementia-friendly communities look like.
Okay, yeah, huge question. Thank you. So I'll start with how I got here. So when I started my master's in planning, at that time, I was really lucky. I got to grow up with all four of my grandparents, my Italian grandparents, my Canadian grandparents, and I grew up in a very walkable community in the East End of Toronto called the Beaches. And my grandparents lived in Oakville at the end of a cul-de-sac in this big suburban house with a pool. And it was this magical place for all of us growing up. And my grandfather, my papa, he passed away. My nanny got diagnosed with Alzheimer's when I was like transitioning into the master's program. And we really watched as the world sort of collapsed in on her. And so, you know, she lost the car, so she wasn't able to drive anymore. She was too scared to take transit when she had in the past. And then she couldn't walk anywhere. Everything was like 2.5 kilometers away. And so I kept wondering, you know, like, would it have been different if she had moved or had lived in a place where I'd grown up, right? And I kid you not, Pamela, it was me Googling randomly one day, and I found out that there were these initiatives to build dementia-friendly communities. So going beyond age-friendly and focusing on those experiences of people with memory loss. And so then I discovered research hadn't been done in North America on people living with dementia. It was mostly concentrated in Europe, and that's why I ended up doing this work.
So what's it like working with people who live with dementia as participants in your research? Like, tell us about how that unfolds.
Yeah, it's a really involved process, and I feel incredibly privileged to be able to do it. How I've started in the past is really going through gatekeepers. So looking for programming and social programs where people are already serving people living with dementia. And going through these gatekeepers is incredibly helpful because they know the person. They know their communication styles. They know sort of their background. And that's really helpful because everyone with dementia is different. They have different symptoms. They have different ways of communicating. And so getting to know them through the gatekeepers, through the program, really spending time with people. When I did the work in Waterloo that we may talk about, I think I spent 20 hours with each person. I really got to know them and their families. And that really helped me as research because they all had different ways of communicating, and you have to be with people in order to understand that, but also using different methods. So we did things like go-along interviews. We used GPS tracking. We got them to take photos, like trying all these different ways to gather data because, you know, not everybody communicates by talking. And so, yeah, how can we get at these other ways of understanding? And the other thing that is really important to note is that some of my participants say, you know, this isn't working for me. I feel really bad. I shouldn't be part of the study. And I would say, you know what? No, it's my job to adapt this method so that you can do it, right? It's not your fault. It's just me. I need to be a little bit more creative about how we do this. How can we work together to get this information? So yeah, it's a lot of time.
So 2 things I want to ask. I'm going to park the COVID question, but I want to ask for a second. So like in terms of like real concrete outcomes, what are some things we should be doing differently in terms of our work as planners, whether it's urban design or it's policy work? Like what are real things that could change that would lead to improvement of life for people living with dementia?
Yeah, and I would say sort of like it's almost like it's a 3-pronged approach. Like one approach is like process, so like who has access to the process. I have some work about how you could adapt the humble open house to someone living with dementia, right? And it is a humble open house, but we all have to do it. So how can we pick better spaces that aren't echoey and don't have lights going everywhere, that feel more calm? How do we build, usually in an open house, they have like all of the boards in a circle, very useful to someone with dementia because it's telling them where to go next. So like ways of doing that, but then also in terms of the actual built environment outcomes, some really interesting things, like for instance, you know, fast arterial roads with like 3 lanes of traffic, 60 kilometers an hour, not great for someone living with dementia, absolutely not. But also not great for us, but for them, it's prohibitive. They don't go there. They don't cross. It's like literally, it's like a fence. They don't pass. And that's really problematic. Another thing that's important to me is wayfinding. So as planners, we talk about landmarks, we talk about Lynchian analysis and edges and nodes and different ways of thinking. But I have really noticed that people with dementia use weird landmarks and in different ways. So in a suburban landscape where things tend to look the same, they look out for the house with the stone garden, the house with the gnome, the house with the red RV, and these different ways, also psychological ways of processing landmarks is a little different from how planners see landmarks. And so trying to bring those two together. And then my favorite story, because this is really interesting, I never thought of it as a planner. So we're walking along, myself and the gentleman living with dementia, and we're walking up to an all-way intersection. And he says, okay, we're gonna cross here. I was like, before the intersection? And he said, yeah. So there was a median in the middle. And
Right.
So for him, so we got across the street, and I said, okay, why did we use the median instead of the intersection? And he said, at the intersection, there's way too much going on. There's red lights and green lights and flashing hands, and you have to negotiate the people, and people turning left and people turning right. And it was way too much information. And so for him, crossing at the median, one thing at a time, was way safer to him than using the intersection. Whereas typical engineering planning would tell you a signalized intersection is the safest place to cross.
So when you're doing this work, who do you partner with? You've talked about gatekeepers. Are you also doing work with community-based organizations?
Yeah. So so the work that's related to dementia, we now have a project in the region of Waterloo about building dementia-inclusive communities. And it comes from basically I did my PhD at Waterloo. So I met all these people in different disciplines working with people living with dementia, but they're in kinesiology and rec and leisure and policy studies. And so we've come together for this project because we realize we're kind of doing things at our own scale and in our own discipline. And now it's about bringing everybody together. And for that, we're partnering with the Alzheimer's Society of Waterloo Wellington, for instance. And we're hoping to build these neighborhood steering teams in rural, suburban, and urban areas in the region, and have the BIAs there and have local schools, and really build this community planning process in these neighborhoods, sort of from the personal level to the policy level. And then I also do work with the Toronto Council on Aging. So we're doing a project with our Greenway Conservancy in the northwest end of the city, trying to bring e-bikes to older adults in that area, and to say, can it change their mobility? And if so, how do we build a community program around that?
So interesting. This summer we were in Quebec on the Petit Train du Nord, the bike path that runs kind of south down towards Montreal from north of Mont-Tremblant. And one of the things we really noticed is how many older adults there were on the bike path using e-bikes. And it was this amazing extension of a wonderful opportunity to a wider range of folks because there was assisted pedaling, right? So Samantha, in the 70s, when there was kind of the first rise of feminist planning and this notion of planning women-friendly cities, one of the arguments is that when you plan a city well for women, everybody benefits and thrives. It seems to me like there are myriad co-benefits. If we brought the age-friendly or dementia-friendly planning lens to community design and building and planning, other people would benefit too. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I would 100% agree. As an anecdote story, so I was on a panel at Ryerson, and it was a disability studies conference. And I was talking about how for people living with dementia, wayfinding signage should not use icons, it should use photographs of the place that you're intending to go, because icons can change over time, they're not universal. And so chatting about this, and someone stood up in the back and they said, I would love for there to be photos because I can't read, or I have dyslexia, or I can't see what's going on. I've also been at conferences talking about the open houses where it was about picking rooms that don't echo and making sure that you lower the sensory stimulation in a room. And someone came up to me who said, I'm autistic, and that would be great for me. That would change a lot of how I interact in space in order to not be overwhelmed. And so, yes, I think there's a lot of potential overlaps, but I'm also really interested in doing the research with multiple different kinds of people, multiple different intersectionalities, because sometimes access needs can conflict. And so we have to figure out, how do they conflict? And then like, how can we co-create a different solution? And for that, I think of like tactile paving is potentially a tripping hazard for someone like an older adult, right? So I think we have to, like, yes, it is better, but we have to be critical of that too, to make sure that all people get included.
It's so interesting. I mean, one of the things as your colleague that your work has really shown me and rounded out is that how we think about accessibility in the work we do. People sometimes think of accessibility as a series of technical standards which need to be checked off. Your research to me makes a case for a much more dynamic and active and engaging approach to continuously asking ourselves, who are we as a community? Who are our community members? What do we need to thrive? And how do we create the physical conditions which can help make people feel comfortable and actually allow them a full engagement in community life, eh? It's a very different, it's more than ramps, right?
Yeah.
Or, sounds on poles, right? Like it's not a technical answer, right? It's so Sam, what's your experience with like how receptive are planners and other allied professionals like designers and policy and decision makers to the work you've done?
For the most part, people have been incredibly receptive. So for instance, I've done like lunch and learns with different city staff and different kinds of municipalities who are interested by the work or who are considering, making guidelines for their open houses. So that's like an easy, here are some things you could do that you could probably do tomorrow, and it wouldn't cost you a lot of money, but it could make a big difference. And also had really great responses from people in planning, but also in sort of allied city departments. So for instance, in the city of Toronto, it's the Department of Senior Services who run the age-friendly strategy that I've been working with, and they're fantastic. And I don't know if they're here, but they are fantastic. And then also, for instance, doing some work out in Oshawa about the experiences of living with dementia and COVID-19. And that municipality is also super supportive. Their senior centers, their innovation team as well. So yeah, people have been quite responsive, and I think that's really great, and I hope to continue that.
Okay, I have a couple more questions, but I'm going to just remind everyone who's listening, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A and we're happy to read them out. Samantha, is there a community that's particularly exemplary or leading the way that you can point to who's kind of on the front edge of this? Like I think back when I was in planning school, Kirkland Lake was rebranding itself as like after its mining situation was in economic decline. They started to position themselves as a great retirement node. Are there places that are embracing your work or proactive on it and making themselves more safe and attractive to seniors?
I would say that they're maybe not embracing my work per se, but out in British Columbia, they now have grants around dementia-friendly communities. And I think that that's a really interesting process to be following and try to see what are the outcomes from it. How does it compare to age-friendly policy as well? And then I would also probably say the region of Waterloo, because there have been all of these connections by virtue of being with the university and hopefully getting to build that as well. And when I think about age-friendly policy, because that's something I've also studied, you want to look at what is the age-friendly plan itself, but also what are their goals and metrics and how are they going to evaluate what they've done? Is there money behind it? And so that's something that I think is really important, because it's nice to have a plan, but it just sits on a shelf if it's not tied to money and tied to specific people and specific departments. And there are a lot of municipalities doing a really good job of that. But I think from the dementia-friendly perspective, those kinds of plans, it sort of remains to be seen what happens, because it's kind of new in terms of the grants that are being given out. But something to keep an eye on for sure.
So when I think about kind of current trends in planning, one of the current obsessions is the 15-minute city, which is, a rebranding of just trying to make things close to home and accessible. Is there any alignment or overlap at all between the principles of the 15-minute city and the work you're doing?
For sure. Especially for someone with dementia who, they're likely to lose their ability to drive, and they're going to have their driver's license taken away from them. So the ability to walk to things really does make a difference. I think I'm also quite aware of the critiques of the 15-minute city and sort of like 15-minute city for whom, and what does that mean? And that's why like my new project that just got funded is going to be focusing on sort of the inner suburban areas of Toronto, specifically Scarborough, because that's a place that has had chronic underinvestment.
Right.
And people are really creative in how they build their care networks and how they build support for themselves. And so, yes, 15-minute city, but also the work I did in Waterloo, everyone lived in a suburb. Yeah. And they loved their suburb because it was familiar to them. And they said that they would be very, very stressed and worried if they had to leave. Yeah. And so there's that too, right? And how does that familiarity play into what we think is safe? And then it adds a whole other layer of complexity for people who are immigrants as well. Something I noticed in my own family of like how my Italian immigrant grandparents experienced place versus the grandparents who'd been born in that place and lived there their whole life.
So one of our participants today asked the question, what role can technology play to augment urban planning for people with dementia? Good question.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting work out there about using different kinds of like GPS trackers, for instance, to keep track of folks. I also, perhaps less high tech, more low tech, but a participant I worked with, he spent all of this time learning how to use his phone to navigate as he was walking. And so he would, take photos of what was around him and like really try to study them and figure out, like reteach himself how to get around this neighborhood. So they can be low tech things. He was also the kind of person who in his phone, he would have your contact info, photos of you from multiple points in your life if he knew you in multiple points. And then he had your social media attached and like when he last talked to you, so that he would have all these prompts, right, for himself. And so, yeah, technology can play, I think, a really great role, but it has to be co-created with people living with dementia. And also, like that example is somebody taking tech that already exists and adapting it for themselves. And so like following that lead, noticing the innovations that people with dementia are already doing, as opposed to, like, here's my idea, let's put it on you.
Yeah. Okay. So we're almost at 11:30. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to formally wrap up and I'm going to say thank you to you, but you have to hang on. I want to remind everyone that this session plus all of the other ones are available on the City Building Ryerson website. We'll pause for a second. If you have a question you'd like to ask Dr. Biglieri yourself directly, you can use the hand up function at the bottom of the screen or ping me a note in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll unmute your microphone and you can ask her directly. So for those of you who just came for the formal part, I'd like to thank you for coming. I'd like to thank the behind the scenes team from City Building Ryerson, Claire Pfeiffer and Luke Nader for making this platform available for us to have this chat. And thanks for making time to come to learn about Dr. Biglieri's research today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Okay, folks, so if you want to ask more questions, chat, Q&A, put your hand up. We're open to all means of identifying anybody who's interested in learning more. We'll just pause for a second, Samantha, and see if people want to jump in. Let's go to participants, see if anyone has their hand up. Okay, I'll ask you a question, Samantha, while we're waiting. Is there a question I should have asked you that I didn't? Something you were hoping to highlight?
Oh, not necessarily. Oh, I just saw a puppy go by. Not that I can think of, but it'll probably come to me later. That's usually what happens.
Yeah. It's so interesting because our profession got its start with public health, right? Like, we only exist because there was cholera in London, right? Like basically, thanks, Jon Snow, and a map. But it's interesting how far apart planning and public health have drifted, but now we're seeing things come back together, right? Which is so much more important. It's a bit I mean, it's the technocratic part of planning, I think, lost its way. It lost its connection to land and people and ecology and health. So I think, the work you're doing is a really important bringing back together and melding of our practice, because how we're going to plan, like, why wouldn't we center people's health and well-being if we're going to invest all this money? Hey,
Right. 100%.
Yeah.
And we are coming back together, right? Like CIP just released the healthy building guidelines a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
Okay, Joe Nasser's got a question. Joe, welcome. Go ahead. I think you're unmuted.
Yes, hello. Very interesting hour so far. I'm a planner by background, but my first, early on at the 1980s, had a very small contract dealing with aging and housing. That's one of my very first little contracting publications, and I didn't pursue this intersection, but I'm wondering, like, that's a long time ago, and it's like, why has it taken so long from your perspective for this issue to be, to make it to planning research? So,
Joe, I think your connection's a little bit wonky, but Samantha, did you hear? Joe's asking what's taken us so long. Yeah.
For aging and housing? Is that
what? Or I mean, in general and specific to the
yeah.
question. Sorry, I'm on the mic.
Like, why has it taken us so long to realize that we're aging? Is that it?
Or that for planning to start, take on the issues that you're dealing with. I mean, or just the fact that you said you didn't find really research in this area in North America.
Yeah, that's a great question, Joe. And I might relate it back to the fact that, like, people living with dementia are still incredibly stigmatized. And so even how even how people talk about raising money for, like, the Alzheimer's Society is very much negative, and like, your life is over, you should go home and pack up your stuff. Kate Swaffer, who's someone living with dementia, an Australian activist, says she calls it prescribed disengagement. And a lot of people in the medical field still talk that way. And it wasn't really until the 1990s where there was this gerontologist named Tom Kitwood, and he started talking about how we need to look at people living with dementia through a personhood lens. Like, they are a person, not just a set of symptoms to be solved or to be pitied. And so that wasn't that long ago. And the sort of seminal work about design and dementia and urban planning only came out in 2006 from the UK. And that's by Burton and Mitchell. And they wrote this wonderful book that talks about these different design features that I actually applied to a site here in Whitby as part of my MRP when I was doing my master's. But that's why, like, I think, there's still even a long way to come in terms of how we engage with people living with dementia. Like, still a lot of studies only ask the care partner what they think. They don't actually ask the person living with dementia about their reality. And so I think that is probably also why, but we're also seeing a boon, like Public Health Agency of Canada is funding dementia-friendly community initiatives. And it's becoming more and more in our, like, language and how we think about things, which I think is a good direction.
Samantha, one of our participants asked the question about any Toronto specific examples where real things have happened.
For me, I'm not necessarily as certain, but I do know that there are a lot of programs, not specifically related to dementia, but I think could really support people living with dementia. And that program is the NORC program, the Naturally Occurring Retirement Communities. And so I think in collaboration with the UHN Open Lab, they have been, recruiting entire buildings in the city, rental buildings, and building out social and community space in the bottoms of them. And then residents in the building get, meals and can participate in different programming right inside their building. And I think that really has the potential to build those social connections and community health supports. It's actually a model that was started in Kingston, Pamela, you'll appreciate. called the Oasis model. And so that has really been moving. And I think that that's a really good example of building that kind of solidarity and support around someone that would improve things for sure.
Great. One of the participants asked in the window about connecting with you. Linda, I sent you Samantha's email because I know she'd be happy to hear from you. So I sent that to you privately. Gil Penaloza, Gil from 880 Cities, you have a question. So Luke, can we unmute Gil and let Gil ask their question?
Yes, thank you, Pamela. I think this series is great, and Dr. Samantha, this is fantastic what you are doing. I have two questions. One is, how are you working with the cities and to eliminate so much ageism, even when it's well intended? For example, as you see in the city of Toronto, all over the place, the city is putting these yellow signs that says senior friendly zones. That's totally ageism, because the overwhelming majority of seniors do not have any mobility issue, only very few. And the people that have mobility issues, they need more time and lights, whatever, regardless if they are 10 or 15 or 30 or 50 or 100 years old. So those signs are kind of telling people, reminding people, oh, seniors are fragile, seniors are weak. Also, they're really dumb because they're only like for 3 blocks at a time. So how do you get there and how do you get out? Do you come on a helicopter and then you leave? Also, civilized cities, they put signs on the few places that are not safe, not on the few places that are safe. So also with regards to the city, things like the washrooms, in the parks, the public washrooms. You go to Hyde Park, I was there last weekend, thousands and thousands of people, and almost all of the restrooms were closed for the season. They are closed 6 months of the year. I mean, we are a winter country. We're a winter city. So, and older people tend to go to the restroom more often, as well as little kids. So then that's really ageist. And the second part that I wanted to ask is, what are your thoughts on the issues of sprawl? Because we need to really have a very strong stand on sprawl, because sprawl really is probably the worst thing that can happen to climate change. I think that, as Dr. Sachs says, sprawl in Ontario is as bad as Alberta's oil sands. And for older people and people with dementia, sprawl it's really horrible, because as you sprawl, it's impossible to have walkable communities and bikeable and public transit. You gotta have some kind of minimum density. So could you tell me a little bit about that? And also, Pamela, I think that Ryerson must work more and more on the older adults, because it's 1/3 of our lives. And cities don't seem to realize, because maybe this is too recent. I mean, we have double our life expectancy in the last 150 years, double. It's amazing. It's probably the most amazing thing that has happened to humanity. And half of it is because less children are dying, but the other half is because we're living longer. So we do need to focus on how to have older people living healthier and happier.
That's why we hired Samantha.
Fantastic. No, that's really good. We need people focused both. And one last comment on that is that our life as older people is 1/3 of our life, and most of it, we're pretty independent. People say, oh, but people, I don't want to live longer if I'm going to be very dependent. When people live to 60, the last 3 or 4 years, they were dependent. When they were to 70, the last 3 or 4, when they to 90, the last 3 or 4, 80% of our life as older adults, we're very independent. And also we need to focus on that group. How are we going to live healthier and happier? So the people that are dependent, like with Alzheimer and others, need to live healthier and happier too. But also the non people with non-dementia also need to live. So we really need to do a much better job at that. We're not doing it.
Yeah, Gil, it's amazing to get to meet you, because I feel like I've only ever seen you talk and watch things, but I'm mostly over here just nodding my head, agreeing with you. Those senior safety signs, I also think are like, yeah, you put the sign up, but for example, there's one at Warden and Lawrence, and I was like recently there, and I was like, this is like a 6-lane highway that gives you 10 seconds to cross the street. Yes, very much a senior safety zone. I think, we have to rethink what that means. I also want to touch on the fact that ageism and ableism also play a role in how we design cities. And I really think it's, it's this myth of the normal body, like the white male 30-something commuting to the office. And we really need to disrupt that because you're right, we do live to a third of our lives or more as an older adult. I agree with you about sprawl and needing to curb sprawl and building more dense communities. That goes back to my own personal experience of why I even started this research growing up in the Beaches neighborhood in Toronto, where you can walk to everything versus like that one area in a suburban municipality. I don't want to hate on Oakville because they do have a lovely downtown. But yeah, no, I'm mostly just here absolutely agreeing with you. And I think there's this other piece of, it's process, it's built environment, but it's also how planners and city builders think about people who are different from themselves, and to really think about what's influencing how we do policy is really important. And then also for me, when we think about dependency, I am a big fan of thinking of all of it. The myth of independence is just that, it's a myth. All of us rely on people, places, things, policies for a variety of different things in our lives. And we're truthfully interdependent. I rely on that streetcar to be working so that I can get downtown if I need to get downtown, right? And so to also reframe the discussion about it being about interdependencies and how do we support people, and like trying to get away from this idea of people living with dementia as always being dependent, because they contribute to their communities in a variety of ways as well. And I had the pleasure of getting to witness that when I did that research, and like how they, because they're at home, they go and do the groceries for the family. They'll go and do the groceries for the neighbor. One lady, she took it upon herself, because it was in Kitchener, to write passive aggressive notes in people's mailboxes if they didn't shovel their sidewalk. Like that's kind of like a community thing too. And so trying to balance that discussion as well, I think will help us rethink like ageism and ableism too. You want to strike that balance for like doing things for people that need it, and then also the stigma. And how do we create that balance? For sure.
I enjoy that you said Oakville has a lovely downtown. Yeah, because it was done 100 years ago. Their credit is that they haven't messed it up. That was nice when Oakville had 40,000 people. But as Oakville grew, they should have done 5 or 6 of those downtowns across. And the people with dementia also, I've seen in London, I've worked in over 350 different cities. And in London, for example, I saw some urban gardening of people with Alzheimer's. And they wouldn't even recognize their sisters and family members, but they had urban gardening and they would tend it. Also, I saw in places like Toyama in Japan, people used to have their family members with Alzheimer's or with other dementias locked in their homes because, they're gonna get lost. So the mayor created this park downtown that is fantastic. And they have lots of activities for people with Alzheimer's. And the family member, they bring him in the morning, they live in there, and then they come back at lunchtime. If they don't find them, no problem, because each one has a GPS, so they can find exactly where they are. And people can participate in programs if they want to, or they can just walk or fish or read or do whatever they want. So I agree with you totally. People with dementia can live healthier and happier too. It's not that it's a lost case. No.
100%. Yeah, it's a great point. And I think the other thing.
Sorry.
Just
squeeze one more question in before we wrap up.
First.
Okay,
Thank you.
so last one from the audience. Great presentation. The feedback says, in my city, new neighborhoods are led and developed by private developers. Is there any research on the cost differential between dementia-friendly community planning and conventional community planning?
Great question. I have a paper on this. Actually, it was my first paper I ever produced. So I actually took those Burton and Mitchell principles that I talked about, the design principles that they'd come up with in 2006. And I actually took them and put them on a base case subdivision in Whitby, Ontario. And I costed out the entire thing. I looked at planning policy. I made sure all of the design recommendations that they had listed were supported by other academic research. And what I found was that it was very doable with, I think it was like a 25% reduction in development charges and a little bit of a reduction in parking. requirements for like mixed use building. But I'd be happy to link you to that. It's from 2018. It was published in Planning Practice and Research as well. And I think you're right. You know, we have to also strike this balance between policy and then, you know, getting developers to implement these kinds of pieces. And I think as planners, we also have to think about that monetary line. But, you know, doing the pro forma and showing a developer that like, yes, you can do this. It's not like, and we'll give you these kinds of incentives. I think that's a really good way to go. That's that back and forth discussion that can happen. So yeah.
That's great. This was super lively. Thank you. So I'm going to thank everyone who's here. Samantha, I'll ask you to stay on just for a minute. This is recorded. I also, without permission, put Samantha's email in the chat if you'd like to follow up, because I know she's key to network. But also, if you're interested in her paper, she can help you find a way to seeing it, reading it. Thanks for coming. Thanks for making time. If you want to rewatch or share, this is on the citybuildingryerson.ca website. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for your great questions. And I look forward to connecting with you.